Alright, so if justice is blind, Parler gets relief. If justice is politicized,
it's no longer justice.
Viva Frei, Montreal litigator turned YouTuber, and I'm back in my home office. The acoustics are great, there is no wind, although people tend to like my outdoor sort of talking fishing vlogs, so I'll try to do a few more of those in the future, but for now, Parler.
Let's talk about it.
And there is actually sort of a linguistic double entendre here. Parler en français means to talk, so let's talk about Parler. Parlons donc de Parler. For those of you who may not know, Parler is sort of a Twitter-like platform. It's a competitor of Twitter in a sense, or it was a competitor of Twitter in a sense, although it had a fraction of the following, but it was an alternative to Twitter. It is partly owned by Dan Bongino, and it was pitched as a free speech alternative to Twitter where you can tweet what you want without the censorship, except on Parler they call them parleys and not tweets. Parler had some famous users on the platform, and it had what can be described as some infamous users on the platform, and those infamous users on the platform just got the platform into big trouble with a bunch of their tweets, or as they call them on Parler, parleys, and Amazon, Google, and Apple seized on those offensive parleys to shut down Parler. Although Parler was not only an app, it primarily functioned through an app, and the other day Google pulled the app from Google Play. Apple pulled the app from the Apple iTunes App Store, and Amazon just pulled their service that they were providing for servers on the internet. These three monopolistic tech giants who basically control the internet effectively wiped Parler off the face of the internet overnight because allegedly Parler was not moderating the content on its website, which these three monopolistic tech giants took to use as the basis to wipe Parler off the face of the internet. Agree or disagree with the decision to do so, the fact that any company has that power should scare everybody. But the fact that any company has the power to do that does not mean that they have the power to do that with impunity, and the other day Parler sued Amazon. I just got a copy of the lawsuit, and we are going to walk through that lawsuit in this vlog. In the United States District Court for the Western District of Washington at Seattle, Parler LLC, plaintiff versus Amazon Web Services Inc., defendant, verified complaint, jury demand requested. First thing to notice here is the jurisdiction or the choice of venue. They have chosen Washington State, so whatever you think the chances of them being able to get a jury of their peers that are going to be friendly to Parler's claims in Washington State, I don't know. That is a question I am putting to the internet. Let me know what you think. Nature of the action. This is a civil action for injunctive relief, including temporary restraining order and preliminary injunctive relief and damages. The nature of the action is important. We have talked about injunctive relief in prior vlogs, so I'm not going to go over it entirely, but an injunction is an order from the court enjoining, ordering someone to do or to stop doing something. You have various types of injunctions depending on the emergency of the relief sought. You have provisional, interlocutory, and permanent injunctions. Provisional are sort of the most urgent injunctions. Interlocutory are sort of intermediary that take you to the final judgment. And permanent injunctions are the final judgment of the court enjoining someone to permanently not do or do something. From what I understand, in certain jurisdictions, the provisional injunction is also referred to as a temporary restraining order, which is an emergency restraining order enjoining someone to do or to not do something on an urgent basis. And as far as I am concerned, in this lawsuit, Parler has a very good claim to obtain a temporary restraining order. But let's not get ahead of ourselves and continue reading the lawsuit, specifically the nature of the action. Last month, defendant Amazon Web Services Inc., AWS, and the popular social media platform Twitter signed a multi-year deal so that AWS could support the daily delivery of millions of tweets. AWS currently provides that same service to Parler, a conservative microblogging alternative and competitor to Twitter. When Twitter announced 2 evenings ago that it was permanently banning President Trump from its platform, conservative users began to flee Twitter en masse for Parler. The exodus was so large that the next day, yesterday, Parler became the #1 free app downloaded from Apple's App Store. Yet last evening, AWS announced that it would suspend Parler's account effective Sunday, January 10th at 11:59 p.m. PST. And it stated the reason for the suspension was that AWS was not confident Parler could properly police its platform regarding content that encourages or incites violence against others. However, Friday night, one of the top trending tweets on Twitter was blank Mike Pence. But AWS has no plans, nor has it made any threats to suspend Twitter's account. Now, for those of you who might be saying to yourselves, this is a useless whataboutism, this lawsuit is not about Twitter, it's about Parler, whether or not these types of parleys were on Parler as a platform, you're right and you're wrong. You are right because in law, they also did it is not a valid legal defense, but you are wrong because this lawsuit is also an antitrust lawsuit, and what the lawsuit alleges is that Amazon services teamed up with Twitter to effectively kill the competition through their monopoly of the internet. Amazon and Twitter is not yet being sued by Parler, although I suspect that check is also in the mail, teamed up together to punish Parler for conduct that Twitter itself was also engaged in. They used their monopolistic control of the internet to crush the competition, hence violating antitrust laws. AWS's decision to effectively terminate Parler's account is apparently motivated by political animus. It is also apparently designed to reduce competition in the microblogging services market to the benefit of Twitter. Thus, AWS is violating Section 1 of the Sherman Antitrust Act in combination with defendant Twitter. AWS is also breaching its contract with Parler, which requires AWS to provide Parler with a 30-day notice before terminating service rather than the less than 30-hour notice AWS actually provided. Finally, AWS is committing intentional interference with prospective economic advantage given the millions of users expected to sign up in the near future. So I am in fact a little confused here because it seems that this might be a typo in that Twitter is not actually a defendant to this lawsuit in as much as I can see, and this lawsuit is not only based on antitrust laws, this lawsuit is based on the contract between Parler and Amazon. According to this lawsuit, under the contract between Parler and Amazon, Amazon is required to give 30-day notice to Parler to cure any default, which they apparently did not do in this case. No 30-day notice to cure any alleged default, just shutting them down overnight, crushing their business. This emergency suit seeks a temporary restraining order against defendant Amazon Web Services to prevent it from shutting down Parler's account at the end of today. Doing so is the equivalent of pulling the plug on a hospital patient on life support. It will kill Parler's business at the very time it is set to skyrocket. The lawsuit then alleges certain facts to explain why Parler is so utterly dependent on Amazon's effective monopoly of the internet, and this should serve as a warning for everyone out there. Parler contracts with AWS to provide the cloud computing services Parler needs for its app and website to function on the internet. Further, that both the apps and the website are written to work with AWS's technology. To have to switch to a different service provider would require rewriting that code, meaning Parler will be offline for a financially devastating period. We then get into certain allegations of fact to flesh out the argument that there are antitrust laws violations. Parler is also a competitor of Twitter, as both provide a similar platform for users to communicate with short messages, links, and pictures. Like many social media platforms, Parler's business model is not based on subscription fees. Less than a month ago, AWS announced with a press release a new multi-year deal with Twitter. AWS will, quote, provide global cloud infrastructure to deliver Twitter timelines, end quote. The lawsuit then alleges that Parler continued to grow astronomically at the expense of Twitter's user base, culminating in the following. This resulted in Parler rocketing to be, quote, the #1 free app in the iOS App Store, up from number 1023, end quote, just a week earlier. Likewise, in that same week, the Parler app went from 486 to first in the Google Play rankings. Not surprisingly, quote, the app was the 10th most downloaded social media app in 2020 with 8.1 million new installs, end quote. The argument here is that Parler began competing with Twitter and chipping away at its user base. Twitter and Amazon have something of an agreement together, and overnight Amazon goes down and shuts Parler for activity that Twitter itself was also engaged in. Two effective internet monopolies teaming up together to crush the competition through their monopoly. The lawsuit then goes on to allege that the trend accelerated when Twitter announced that it had banned Donald Trump's account from Twitter. In 2021, this trend not only continued, it accelerated thanks to Twitter's announcement 2 days ago that it would permanently ban President Trump from its platform. On that day, last Friday, Parler saw installs increase in the United States by 355%. After Twitter's announcement, conservative politicians and media figures began encouraging their followers to switch to Parler. Speculation began to mount that President Trump would likewise move to Parler. Given the close to 90 million followers the president had on Twitter, this would be an astronomical boon to Parler and a heavy blow to Twitter. The lawsuit then gets into the context of Amazon pulling the plug on Parler, which goes as follows. Yesterday evening at 6:07 PST, web news site BuzzFeed posted an article with screenshots of a letter from AWS to Parler, informing Parler that its account would be suspended at 11:59 p.m. PST on Sunday, less than 30 hours later. Strangely, the article with the letter was posted before Parler itself received the letter in an email received at 7:19 p.m. PST, over an hour after the BuzzFeed article went online, meaning AWS leaked the letter to BuzzFeed before sending it to Parler. This death blow by AWS could not come at a worse time for Parler, at a time when the company is surging with the potential of an even more explosive growth in the next few days. Worse than the timing is the result. Parler has tried to find alternative companies to host it, and they have fallen through. It has no other options. Without AWS, Parler is finished, as it has no way to get online. And the delay of granting this TRO by even 1 day could also sound Parler's death knell as President Trump and others move onto other platforms. It is no wonder then that competitor Twitter's CEO has heartily endorsed efforts to remove Parler from the public sphere. Now, it is important to appreciate the rationale for why Amazon pulled the plug on Parler, and it relates to certain offensive and threatening parleys or tweets that were found on Parler. certain tweets from certain lawyers calling for certain acts of violence against certain politicians. That was the justification for why Amazon pulled the plug on Parler, except for the fact that those exact same kinds of tweets were not only on Twitter, they were in fact trending on Twitter at the same time. Trending on Twitter at the same time, and what does Amazon do? It doesn't pull the plug on Twitter, it pulls the plug on Parler. It pulls the plug on Parler, a competitor to Twitter with whom Amazon just signed a multi-year agreement. Now let me just open a parenthesis so that there is no misunderstanding here. I am very much a proponent of free speech, but I do draw the line at threats of violence. I know that some of you out there are going to say that I am not truly a proponent of free speech if I place certain limitations on speech, to which I would respond, there are certain limitations that I can place on free speech, one of which is overt death threats. So nothing in this vlog is intended to defend those parleys on Parler, nor to defend those tweets on Twitter. In fact, I was discussing why those tweets were still on Twitter at the time they were still on Twitter. The question here is unequal treatment by one monopoly towards a competitor of another monopoly with whom they just contracted a multi-year agreement. And the other issue is just a contractual relationship that provides a delay to cure alleged defaults, which was apparently not provided to Parler in this situation. And the other thing actually is just pure abuse of right, even in the event that Amazon had the contractual right to do what it did, but we're going to get there at the end of this vlog. What is more, by pulling the plug on Parler but leaving Twitter alone despite identical conduct by users on both sites, AWS reveals that its expressed reason for suspending Parler's account are but pretext. In its note announcing the pending termination of Parler's service, AWS alleged that, quote, over the past several weeks, we've reported 98 examples to Parler of posts that clearly encourage and incite violence, end quote. AWS provide a few examples, including one that stated, and I can let you read it yourself. AWS further stated to Parler that the, quote, violent content on your website violates our terms, end quote. Because AWS declared, quote, we cannot provide services to a customer that is unable to effectively identify and remove content that encourages or incites violence against others, end quote. AWS announced the pending termination of Parler's account. However, the day before, on Friday, one of the top trends on Twitter was, and you can read it for yourself, with over 14,000 tweets. And earlier last week, a Los Angeles Times columnist observed that Twitter and other social media platforms are partly culpable for the Capitol Hill riot by allowing rioters to communicate and rile each other up. Yet these equivalent, if not greater, violations of AWS's terms of service by Twitter have apparently been ignored by AWS. And again, this is not a childish whataboutism. Look at Twitter, they did something bad also, but they're not being punished. This is in the context of building a Sherman Act antitrust laws violation argument as they do right now. Count 1, Sherman Act, Section 1. AWS is prohibited from contracting or conspiring to restrain trade or commerce. Parler restates, realleges, and incorporates by reference each of the allegations set forth in the rest of this complaint as if fully set forth herein. Section 1 of the Sherman Act prohibits, quote, every contract, combination in the form of trust or otherwise, or conspiracy in restraint of trade or commerce. Quote, to state a claim under Section 1, a plaintiff must allege facts that, if true, will prove 1. The existence of a conspiracy, 2. Intention on the part of the co-conspirators to restrain trade, and 3. Actual injury to competition, end quote. Less than a month ago, AWS and Parler's competitor Twitter entered into a multi-year deal. Last Friday evening, Twitter banned President Trump from using its platform, thereby driving enormous numbers of its users to Parler. 24 hours later, AWS announced it would indefinitely suspend Parler's account. AWS's reasons for doing so are not consistent with its treatment of Twitter, indicating a desire to harm Parler. That is the argument for the antitrust laws violation, and it's something of an uphill battle in that they're going to have to prove a conspiracy of sorts between these two de facto monopolies. I think the argument is there. It's going to be an interesting argument to make, but it's not their only argument. They also have a contractual argument. Count 2, breach of contract. AWS breached its contract with Parler by not providing 30 days notice before terminating its account. Under Washington law, quote, a breach of contract is actionable only if the contract imposes a duty.
Duty.
The duty is breached.
Duty.
And the breach proximately causes damage to the claimant, end quote. The AWS customer agreement with Parler allows either party to terminate the agreement, quote, for cause if the other party is in material breach of this agreement and the material breach remains uncured for a period of 30 days from receipt of notice by the other party, end quote. On January 8, 2021, AWS brought concerns to Parler about user content that encourages violence. Parler addressed them, and then AWS said it was, quote, okay with Parler. The next day, January 9, 2021, AWS brought more, quote, bad content to Parler, and Parler took down all of that content by the evening. Thus, there was no uncured material breach of the agreement for 30 days as required for termination. Further, while AWS used the term, quote, suspension in its notice to Parler, it stated that it would, quote, ensure that all of your data is preserved for you to migrate to your own servers and will work with you as best we can to help your migration, end quote. This is not action AWS would take for a temporary suspension, but rather for a permanent termination. Thus, whatever words AWS used, it was terminating the agreement with Parler. Based on the allegations of the lawsuit, there is a contract between the parties. That contract provides that either party may terminate the agreement on 30 days' notice in the event of a material breach that remains uncured for 30 days. There are two material conditions that must be met under the terms of that contract. One, the breach must be material and it must last for 30 days without being cured after a notice to that effect. It's not just any breach that can be used to terminate the agreement. It must be a sufficiently serious, therefore material breach to justify the notice. And even if the breach is in fact a material breach under the terms of the contract, there still is a period during which the parties can basically minimize their damages by doing what is necessary to cure that breach or to set up other servers in the event that they terminate the agreement after 30 days. But there is, I suspect, even another argument in all of this, in that even if they had the right to do what they did under the terms of the contract, there is nonetheless an obligation or an expectancy of good faith in the execution of contracts. Even if Amazon could do what they did under the terms of the contract, if they do it abusing of their right to do so, they can still be sanctioned, I imagine, by the courts in Washington. At the very least, they could in Quebec. In Quebec, we have the textbook case of abuse of right that everybody studies in law school. It is called Banque Nationale contre Sucis or Houle, but it is National Bank versus Sucis or Houle, where the National Bank called their loan as they had the right to do under the contract. They had the right to call their loan, but they exercised that right in such an abusive way to cause the maximum amount of damages to the borrower. They called the loan, the guy didn't have the money to pay for it, they liquidated all of his assets, sold shares in stocks at a loss just to satisfy their abusive calling of the loan, and they were held liable for abuse of right. They had the right to call the loan, but they did it in such an abusive manner, caused so much damage in the abusive manner in which they did it, that they were still nonetheless held responsible. I don't know if a similar concept exists under Washington law. I suspect it does. So I suspect that even if Amazon had the right to do what they did under the contract, although I don't think they did, that they can still nonetheless be found liable. And Parler raises one last cause of action: tortious interference with business expectancy. By terminating Parler's account, AWS will intentionally interfere with the contracts Parler has with millions of its present users, as well as with the users it is projected to gain this week. In Washington, quote, the elements of tortious interference with a contract or expectancy are: 1. The existence of a valid contractual relationship or business expectancy. 2. The defendant's knowledge of that relationship. 3. An intentional interference inducing or causing a breach or termination of the relationship or expectancy. 4. The defendant's interference for an improper purpose or by improper means. And 5. Resulting damage. AWS intentionally will interfere with Parler's current contracts and future expected customer relationships by terminating Parler's agreement with it under the pretext that Parler was in violation of that contract when AWS knew Parler was not in violation, and when Twitter was engaging in identical conduct but AWS did not terminate its contract with Twitter. Parler will be severely damaged financially and reputationally if it must go offline Sunday at midnight because AWS terminates Parler's account. Prayer for relief. Plaintiff respectfully requests that the court A. Grant Parler's motion for a temporary restraining order and order AWS to maintain Parler's account until further notice from this court, and to refrain from suspending, terminating, or failing to provide any services previously provided under Parler's customer agreement with AWS. B. Grant Parler damages, including treble damages, in an amount to be determined at trial. C. Grant Parler such other relief as the court deems just and proper. That is the lawsuit. I now have to go and find out whether or not the temporary restraining order was issued. Let me know what you all think of the lawsuit. I think it has a very, very good chance of success on the merits, and I suspect sooner than later Amazon will in fact reinstate Parler. Amazon will in fact reinstate Parler, but they have just flexed their muscle to the world to let everybody know that they can shut down anybody and anyone whenever they want. And unless the court sanctions this conduct so that it is no longer in any form of a financial or political interest for a company to do something like that, they will continue to do it again. And if you think they're only going to do it to people you don't like, you one day will find that you are grossly mistaken. Censorship is a proverbial blob. For those of you who are old enough to have ever seen that movie, the blob just keeps eating everything in its way, and it keeps getting bigger and bigger and eating more and more until it finally engulfs everything.
The organism is growing at a geometric rate. By all accounts, it's at least 1,000 times its original mass.
The Vlawg. Terror has no shape.
And as far as I am concerned, there is in fact no legitimate place on the internet for overt calls to violence or threats against the lives of others, but parties also have to respect their contracts and give them the time required to cure those defaults if they occur. There is a reason why the contract provided a 30-day notice to cure certain defaults, because with all of the chatter on the internet, it is impossible to do it on the moment, and by the allegations in the lawsuit, it looks like Parler did it, and Amazon nonetheless shut them down. Justified or political pretext, you decide, but with that said, if you like my videos and you like my content, please be sure to like, share, subscribe, hit the notification bell, drop a comment in the comment section below because it feeds the algorithm.
Feed me Seymour. Feed me Seymour.
If you want to support the channel, all of these support links are in the pinned comment. We've got PayPal, Patreon, Subscribestar, YouTube membership. We've got merch. Robert Barnes and I have a page on Locals. It is called vivabarneslaw.locals.com. I am also on Rumble, where you can follow me there if you want to break away from the YouTube monopoly. But more importantly than any of that, take care of yourselves. Check in on friends and family. Make sure everyone around you is doing well. And now you know you're followed. Peace out. Yeah.